there certainly are skills, or I'll call them more personality traits, that are a little more helpful, right? Let's say if you have from a sales perspective, right? So I think some of those innate behaviors could be things like being a little more extroverted, perhaps being a little more outgoing, a little more engaging, having a natural and genuine desire to want to learn about others, right, and help others. I think the personality trait of empathy and having empathy towards others, that is certainly something that you can be born with, but definitely can be developed over time based on life experience or based on just growing those traits.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Nick Kane. Nick's the managing partner of the Janek Performance Group. Now, we had a really fun conversation. We dig into three important topics. Now, first and foremost, we talk about Nick's passion for bourbons. In fact, Nick posted a list online of what he considers the very best bourbons to help you celebrate a big sales win. So then we go through that list. And then after that, we dive into the whole subject of what it takes, actually what is really required to develop a good salesperson. And we detour a little bit into why sales training keeps failing that individual seller and what can be done to change that. Then we dig into a couple topics that Nick has recently been writing about. First, how to engage the empowered B2B seller. And then we go deep into the 4 selling skills salespeople need in order to win with today's empowered buyer. So we get into this and much, much more. But before we get to Nick, I want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
Pleasure. So where have you been hiding out during the pandemic?
Mostly in my home, moving from room to room to find a different experience week to week.
And your home is where?
I'm actually in just outside of Las Vegas in Southern Nevada.
Las Vegas. And I mean, Las Vegas, you and I talked about this a bit before we started recording, is a changed place, as every place is. But I mean, that one place in particular, I think, where people congregate in large numbers, and it's like, yeah, that has to be different.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, it's a totally different experience being in Las Vegas, at least in the tourist areas, right, on the Strip and
right.
That sort of thing. It's certainly very different than it was pre-pandemic.
Are your kids actually going to school, or do you have kids? Are they actually going to school, or?
I do. Yeah, I have 3. The oldest is not in school currently. She just finished her undergrad. The second is in school, in college, but all online. And then the third is actually going to school.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, of course, they gave you a discount on the tuition because you're doing it online.
Yeah, or not.
Yeah. Well, so what year in college is your daughter who's doing it online?
She's a freshman.
She's a freshman. So this is quite a different experience for her, and compared to other typical freshman year where everybody shows up. I mean, does she, what she feel? I was sort of interested in what she's going through and what she feels about what she might be missing.
Yeah. She definitely is. It's an interesting time for her. The experience is certainly not what you would expect as a freshman going into college. She's primarily home,
yeah,
or and doing classes completely online. So it's you don't get the same get-togethers, you don't get the same social experience. That's for sure. And even just from an educational standpoint, very different than being in a large lecture or that sort of thing. Everything's obviously done on Zoom. Or some sort of platform like that. So yeah, she, on one hand, she doesn't necessarily know what she's missing, as a freshman. But she certainly had enough exposure from her older sister to get an idea. And, I know she wishes she was in school,
yeah,
like normal.
And which school is she attending?
Here in Las Vegas at UNLV.
UNLV, okay.
Yeah.
Are they playing football?
They are. They actually are. Yep.
That's crazy. Are they letting people in the stands?
They are.
Doubly crazy. Okay.
Yeah. Very, very limited capacity. The Raiders started here this year.
Oh,
they have no fans coming in, but UNLV has decided to let some fans in to the new stadium.
Oh, so UNLV is playing in the Raiders stadium?
They are. Yeah. Yes, they are.
Well, I guess that's an upgrade over that small one. I always seem to remember passing it coming in from the airport. It's like,
Oh,
yeah,
that's an understatement.
yeah, small one. Yeah, okay. All right. Well, question for you is, I've been asking this to all my guests, is what's the biggest lesson you've learned about yourself personally during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is definitely finding ways to continue to stay motivated and disciplined in a very uncertain and difficult time. You learn a lot about yourself when you are in your home for months at a time, limited, social experience. When you're used to being in an office environment around people every day, it really changes the atmosphere and it changes the mindset, right?
Yeah.
So I think I've learned a lot just about myself and around self-discipline and time management and just making sure that I am continuing to try to be as productive as I believe I am typically, but in a totally different environment. So, I find myself just kind of challenging myself every day, every week with doing things a little bit differently, perhaps managing time a little bit differently, but always with the focus of staying as productive and engaged as possible.
So how many people in your company?
In total, between those that work here and outside of the office and abroad, around 50 total.
Okay. And so how's business been for you?
Business has been surprisingly good. When the pandemic started, there was such uncertainty just economically, but especially in our business, as a sales performance company that offers training services as a primary service. Most of those services are delivered in person.
Right.
Organizations are bringing people into a central place, and everybody's together in a room, and it's just a very different experience. So that shift to having to train virtually, which we've done for many years, but just not nearly to the degree that we are today, created a lot of uncertainty in the market. Do we want to do that? Are we going to do that? And then also you had the economics of uncertainty at that time as well. So as an organization, we didn't know where things were going to go, and quite frankly, we're planning for a down year. But it really hasn't been that. It's actually been a very successful year overall. There's been a high amount of demand for different types of curriculum, for different types of training and learning modalities, and I think organizations realize that their sellers and sales leaders need additional skills, right, in this environment. And regardless, as long as you can deliver those effectively and do it, in a way that is cost effective, there's still a strong demand for it. So overall, the year has turned out to be far better than what we, anticipated at the start of COVID.
Yeah, and I think that seems to have been the case for a lot of companies that are sort of in your space, or sales performance, sales training, and so on. Is perhaps companies took it as an opportunity to say, well, let's take this as an opportunity to invest in our team that perhaps we felt we were too busy to do before, or something, because it's been a fairly consistent story among people. Like I said, doing what you're doing, that business has been very good this year.
Yeah, so it's not just us then.
No, it seems to have been across the board. So I think it's sort of maybe the nudge for companies to finally say, look, we can do more of this virtually, right? It's great to bring Nick in, it's great to bring Andy in and talk at our sales kickoff meeting and so on, but it's like, we get the same benefit, just and hopefully pay less by having somebody do it virtually.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so let's talk about something really important first, which is a blog article you had that was the best bourbons to use to celebrate a win. Now, did you write that?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
I figured you did. And so let's go through this, because that's an important thing. We need to celebrate wins, and I'm a big bourbon fan, and there are a couple there I hadn't heard of before. So your favorite was one called Larceny. And I had not heard. That's the one I had not heard of. That intrigued me. I was looking it up online after I read the article.
Yeah, I really do enjoy that bourbon a lot. It's a Kentucky bourbon, and it is. I tend to really like wheated bourbons. So that is a weeder, if you will,
Right, right.
in bourbon talk. But that is a weeded bourbon, and they have different, degrees of that and different editions of it based on barrel proofing and that sort of thing. But that particular one has just a great taste. It's reasonably priced. Just a good weeded bourbon.
What's the impact of the wheat on the bourbon flavor or the whatever?
Yeah,
the proof.
For me, I think for me it just offers a more balanced taste to the bourbon. It removes some of the heat for me at the beginning. If it's a higher proof,
right,
but it has some wheat, it's not as hot, if you will.
Interesting. I'd like that because I don't like the hot bourbons.
Mm-hmm.
So your next one is Four Roses Small Batch, which a couple years ago, a friend did a favor for me, in the sales space. And I said, yeah, thank you very much. What can I do to repay you? It was Four Roses. So that was the first time I'd really sort of said, okay, well, I'll get one for myself and try it. And that was awfully good as well.
Yeah, I really enjoy that one a lot as well. The small batch, and they have a small batch select as well. Again, just really good quality product. Another, great Kentucky-based bourbon.
Yeah, and then you got Eagle Rare from Buffalo Trace. Love that. Maker's Mark 46. I really like the Maker's Mark 46. I think that's, I don't know whether it's aging in the French oak or whatever, but that one hits my spot pretty well. You had Woodford Reserve. Have to admit, not a big fan of Woodford Reserve. Too big of a bite for me.
Mm-hmm.
Michter's good. Wild Turkey Rare Breed, good. So last, you give a shout out to a bourbon made in Las Vegas. So tell us about that one.
Yeah. So that one is called Smoke Wagon. There's a couple that have become more popular. One in particular in Las Vegas, and then another one in northern Nevada called Frey Ranch. But Smoke Wagon is getting a ton of buzz in the bourbon space. Their stuff is selling out like crazy, and it's they have a few different levels to their bourbons. Starts off with the straight bourbon, it's called. They do a small batch. They do an uncut, unfiltered. And then they have one called a private barrel, and then they have one called Desert Jewel. Their bottles are beautiful, right? They're all like Italian glass, really, really cool packaging, but the quality of the bourbons are excellent. So they're bringing the product in from Indiana. It's like an MGP product that comes in, and that's where
MGP
the corn
meaning?
It's a term for Indiana-based corn and mash bill that they bring in.
Got it.
That's becoming more popular in the bourbon space, but then they distill it and finish it in Las Vegas.
Yeah, so it's like in vintners that buy grapes from a specific vineyard and then bring it into their facility and make the wine with it.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's whenever these
designer corn.
Exactly. Yeah. Whenever they release new bottles, they tend to sell out very quickly. At least here in the Las Vegas market, they're doing extremely well.
Huh. All right. Do they ship out of state?
Yeah, I believe so.
Right.
I think they have national distribution. Definitely would recommend picking some up.
All right. It's on my list. Going to Bevmo. Here we go. I was reading that list has made me think, it's like, do you have any like good drinking stories with a client?
Yeah, I don't know how tons of those, right? Some you want to talk about, some you may not want to talk about.
Well, let's talk about the ones you don't want to talk about.
Yeah, I do have a good drinking story that not necessarily with a client, but definitely led to the creation and development of Janek as an organization.
Oh, okay.
So before starting Janek in 2005, I was working abroad with my now counterpart here at Janek, the other managing partner, Justin. We worked together at a previous company, and we were working abroad in the Philippines, operating a call center there at that time. And we started having discussions about sales and sales training and sales performance and what that could look like, knowing that we were both very passionate about training and development, but also around sales performance. And we started having discussions about the possibility of a company, right? And doing that together. And we ended up making that decision to move forward over a scotch at that time on the 35th floor of a hotel that we were staying at that time when we were living in the Philippines.
In Manila?
In Manila,
Yeah.
yeah, in Metro Manila downtown,
Makati.
and I in Makati area,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
been there.
and
Yeah.
I will always remember it was we were drinking a Chivas Regal, which I don't drink a whole lot now, but that over that Scotch created what is now turned into Janek 15, 16 years later.
Very cool. Very
Yeah.
cool. So, right, let's get onto the subject of sales. It's something, it's something you'd written. I'd seen this question. It's always good to ask people. So, are there certain innate skills that good sellers are born with, or can anybody be made into a good seller?
Yeah, I think if there certainly are skills, or I'll call them more personality traits, or, that that are a little more helpful, right? Let's say if you have from a sales perspective, right? So I think some of those innate behaviors could be things like being a little more extroverted, perhaps being a little more outgoing, a little more engaging, having a natural and genuine desire to want to learn about others, right, and help others. I think the personality trait of empathy, right, and having empathy towards others, that is certainly something that you can be born with, but definitely can be developed over time based on life experience or based on just growing those traits. But I also think that sales comes down to a repeatable set of selling skills that, if consistently performed, can make you a top performing sales professional. And I don't think you necessarily have to be born with all of those traits, and certainly don't necessarily have to have those skills naturally. To me, sales is no different than any other thing you practice, right? Whether that's a sport, whether that is another job that you perform. There's a set of repeatable skills that I know we've identified through our research, and we've seen that work.
So what are those?
In terms of high performance. So I mean, I think there's a variety. I think certainly the skill around questioning, right, and being able to understand the needs, objectives, desires of the person you're working with and partnering with and helping with, is definitely a big part of successful sales. I think strong listening skills is critically important. If you're not a good listener and you're more, you miss opportunities to capture the information that you need to be able to service the customer and be able to solve their problems. I think the ability to develop ideas and insights for a client, be able to bring some of those to the table and get the customer to think a little differently, depending on the sales environment and the level of sophistication within that organization. Sometimes that's less important, right? If it's more transactional.
Sure.
But those are some of the skills that come to mind. And to me, all of those can be learned, right? You don't have to be born with them.
So the most effective way to learn them, though, and this seems to be, to your point earlier about your business is good now, doing things virtually, but in your experience is what's decisive in developing? And I say a good seller because I have to admit I'm sort of tired of this whole idea about everything we do is oriented towards the mythical top performer. Because give me a strong bench of good sellers, and I'll probably be more successful than one that relies on one or two really good people. So to develop somebody to be a good seller is what are really the key things? Because I did an informal survey about this earlier this year, and it's like, was it coaching? Was it a mentor? Was it your customers? Was it watching your peers? What was most decisive? And I was asking people that, sort of fell into what you might think this top performer group was, and pretty broad range of answers. But for a lot of people, it was either the customer or coaching.
Yeah.
And training for a lot of people is at the bottom of the list.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all those things you said. But if I had to say if one that stood out to me, I definitely think it is coaching and ongoing development more broadly. I think training, sometimes there's a misconception of training being this event, and that's it. Right? You're either bringing people together or you're doing it virtually, but it is an event that you are going to. Any organization that thinks that training is going to be the answer and they just look at it as an event are going to get very limited results. I think training, the intent is to establish the skills in a consistent environment where we can practice those skills in a safe environment. We can work with our peers to start to apply those skills to real deals and real accounts. And that helps us start to conceptualize how those skills could work. the real work and development starts after training, right? I think any organization that wants to implement sales training effectively has to have the right plan before, during, and after training to make sure that skills stick and behaviors change, and you're gaining institutional capability that an organization desires when they are implementing training. But if you're going to develop skills over time, again, no different than anything else you're working on, you have to practice it. You have to, be willing to fail, and be willing to get back on the horse, if you will, right, with the right support. And to me, I think that's the biggest challenge that we see organizations face is frontline managers, right, or sales leaders of frontline sellers tend to be some of the most underserved, right, in the sales organization. They get promoted quickly because they typically they get promoted quickly because they have strong sales performance and sales acumen. They do well in their role, and then they're off and running. They're not typically given the skills to be highly effective coaches, managers, leaders, et cetera. And that tends to weigh down an organization's performance. So if it was anything, to me, I think the linchpin to success in developing selling skills is definitely having a coach, having a manager, a mentor, if you will, that is there to support you as you're implementing these skills and you're starting to make them consistent.
And to your point, which I take it sort of a step further, which is that, we have to service that person that's providing that coaching, that mentoring, because there's this huge assumption that's existed in companies for certainly, I think, as long as companies have existed, is that if you give someone a title, by definition, they have the skills and talents they need to be able to do that job. And there's nothing frontline managers know about performance improvement. It's not because they should know, it's just they haven't been trained, right? There's a very specific set of things you have to do to improve someone's performance or coach somebody. But this sort of goes on up the line. I mean, we do the same thing we assume somebody's a VP of sales, that they know about mindset and psychology of performance and performance improvement and all these discrete skills they just don't have. So how do we get companies, and this is a big thing for me, is companies just basically don't invest in sales in a meaningful way. Oftentimes, even large organizations, they start paying lip service to it. We'll get this online service we're doing now, or in the past it was bring high-priced talent in to speak at our sales kickoff, and then, to your point, sort of event-driven, and that was it for the year. We spent our budget. How do we change that culture? Because we're seeing it in other performance-based professions. Sports is one I refer to it oftentimes, where they have become very data-driven, very analytical, very specialized in their knowledge they're applying to how do we help people get better at their job.
Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack, right? I think obviously there needs to be discussion at the top of an organization to help the sales leader or whoever's responsible for overseeing the sales organization see the value of making that type of investment. I know for us, we measure the results. We intently measure the results of all the training that we deploy. We do that through a third-party tool that's owned by Gartner. So we have valid proof and return on investment data and things that we can share that help build the business case for that investment. But you have to have a partner there that's willing to listen to that conversation, right, and willing to at least take into consideration what that investment could turn into.
What does the tool from Gartner measure?
It actually is a scientifically validated tool that measures and isolates the effectiveness of a training deployment on a session by session basis.
So give us an example.
So it basically uses self-assessed data and it brings in manager reported data based on observation. And there's a series of questions that are asked of the seller or the manager, right, if they're receiving the training, that focuses on implementation of those skills in the real world. To what degree do they anticipate performance to improve? There's, again, just a series of questions. There's an algorithm that's built into it that isolates bias and reduces those figures. But basically, it's using the seller's data and their manager's data to provide ROI figures.
Does it draw on data from Salesforce or other CRM systems, so it correlates it out to results?
This particular tool doesn't. No, we do that with clients independently of this assessment process, where we're looking at that type of data and measuring that type of data based on the KPIs they're looking at closely. This is specifically around, it's short of doing a full-blown ROI study, which we all know is extremely costly and time-consuming and that sort of thing. It's using the anticipated results from the seller's perspective and the manager's perspective based on their observation.
Yeah. See, this gets to a point with me that and this is not critical of what you're doing, it's just sort of observation, is that, so much of what we rely on, though, in sales, in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of what we do, is based on self-reported or self-assessed data. And we're crying out for the equivalent of a longitudinal study, like they've analogous to what they do in the pharmaceutical industry and so on, where we actually could track through how it tracks to results.
Yeah,
and that's such a huge gaping hole. I'm just wondering, why, in your mind, why do you think no one's ever filled that? Because I look at the self-assessed data, and for me, that's, as soon as I see that self-assessed, I put a big discount on it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I hear you there. I think that the challenge is, and let me say that we definitely look at that with some clients if that's a desire, for sure, and we're looking at that. The challenge is, it's difficult to isolate. The reason why we like this assessment process is because it actually can isolate what the training is doing specifically. It's difficult to account. Let's just say it was a large sales training intervention with a Fortune 500 company. The sales training is not the only thing that affects the outcomes.
Right.
That's the challenge.
Absolutely.
So when you're trying to assess that type of data, right, and you look at things like competitive landscape, pricing changes, product changes, there's so many things that affect those outcomes. It's really challenging to just say sales training created that specifically. So that's why that self-assessed data is useful in that regard, and that's why we bring managers in to help validate that as well, because they can observe their sellers' activities and help validate, is the data accurate? Are they using these skills? To what degree are they using the skills? How much has performance improved? So it definitely adds another layer that does help the validity of the feedback.
Yeah. Well, and I was just sort of thinking, there's lots of other sort of inherent biases that also affect outcomes as well, in terms of distribution of accounts, leads, right, and sort of go down how the organization's managed. That's what I'm saying, is it seems like we need a better, more objective way of trying to really capture this, and I feel like it's a huge need that's out there. Somebody can fill that. So in your mind, when you're developing sellers, sort of what's sort of the single biggest issue or challenge? And, is it skills? Is it mindset? Is it, oftentimes I think it's perspective, which I guess you could almost sort of blend a little bit with mindset, is like, do sellers even really know what they should be doing? Right? It's we train them up and say, go out and persuade somebody to buy your product. And it's like, well, is that really the perspective and the mindset, or is it, we've talked about this again for a long time, but is your job really to help your buyer make a decision? And I think these differences, even if they seem subtle at times in terms of just what's in the seller's mind, is a huge difference when it gets in front of a seller or a buyer. I'm sorry, I keep mixing up my buyer and sellers, but just this change in perspective is significant.
Yeah, it is. It is difficult to isolate the one thing, right? Because I think, the culture of the organization has to support the right mindset, based on whatever that sales environment is. Again, sometimes sales can be more transactional, and for that reason, perhaps the focus on the customer isn't quite as important. To me, that should always be at the center of any effective sales organization, but it just, that focus becomes less important, right? When it's a one-call close, if you will. So it is difficult to isolate, but I do think, when you're implementing sales training, right, you're trying to change behavior, you're trying to develop salespeople's skills, right? Ultimately, that's the goal. I think sales training fails typically boils down to a couple things. One is, how strong is the communication plan and the change management strategy going into the training intervention? I think if you have the right communication plan, if you can share with the sellers why this is valuable to them, what's in it for them, what their role is in successfully implementing this, and then you can also do that, top down, right? And sales leaders understand their role, et cetera. I think you tend to have a much higher likelihood of success because everybody knows their role, they're excited, and they're bought in coming into the training. So that helps lift skill development because people come in with the right mindset around development. And then I think it has to just be the right fit. The IP or methodology has to be the right fit. The trainers that are training this have to be the right fit. So I think that's critically important. And then I think the last thing is just enabling the sales leaders, which we talked about earlier. If you're going to develop a seller's skills and seek to move them into the middle, right, if you will, then not everybody, I completely agree with your sentiment earlier. Like this idea of top performers, that top 10% or 20% don't necessarily drive the effectiveness of a sales organization overall.
Right.
It's typically the middle that, achieves revenue targets overall. So if we can at least get people into that productive zone, if you will, that's a win, right? But I think in order to do that, managers have to be coaching. They have to know what their role is. They have to have the skills to coach and the bandwidth to coach, right, and the time. And a lot of that just comes down to assessing the organization, right? Do we have the right people in the right roles? Are we setting them up for success? Do they have the time, right, to be able to do it? Like that sort of thing. If managers are coaching and you're implementing training that is strong, that's typically a formula for success.
Well, it's interesting to talk about the time to coach, which is something that's is discussed all the time. Sorry for being redundant with that, but that's just a matter of priorities, right? As an organization has to say, number one priority is coaching. Second priority, third priority, whatever, is producing the reports you need to produce, or whatever the other things that may consume your time as a manager. And you have to make that priority sacrosanct, right? If we're blocking in my calendar for the week, then I'm going to spend 2 hours a day coaching with my team, one-on-ones or whatever. Nothing gets in the way of that. But you see it's such a slippery slope is this is what you talked about. It's the most common refrain we hear about coaching is, I don't have time.
Yeah, no question. It's an interesting observation there. So the one thing that we know sales leaders are consistently focused on is from a frontline seller's perspective is how much time are they spending selling, right? I'm sure you guys hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Right. Like what can we do to get those administrative tasks out of the way so we can make sellers generate revenue as much as possible, right? And put them in the position to be able to do that effectively. You don't hear those conversations as much at the manager level, which is interesting to me. It's like, why are we not focused on the revenue generation that a manager is responsible for and tying the tasks and activities that they need to do to generate revenue and removing some of their administrative duties? A frontline manager's role now has become so much around reporting and data input and, filling out specific, PI, PIPs and that sort of thing. It's just, we have to try to remove some of those activities or at least automate some of those activities and really understand the value of doing that and putting them in the role to be able to generate revenue. They generate revenue through their salespeople, right? But those conversations, and I'm having those with sales leaders, they tend to not focus on that as much. It's always on the seller.
Well, I understand that. I mean, so I've had this conversation a number of times, and the same thing, this desire, this aspiration to create more selling time for salespeople. I look at it from a different perspective, and this comes from hands-on experience and growing teams from this perspective, which was true. It'd be nice to be able to create more selling time out of the day as it exists. But when you look at the statistics about how much of their time sellers actually spend engaged in actual selling, that number hasn't really moved for decades. Even in the face of all these technological advances we've had over the last 30, 40 years, generally sellers spend about a third of their time selling. And so rather than sort of trying to push that wet noodle up a hill, how about just focusing on making the sellers more productive in the time they actually do sell so that they are generating more revenue per hour of selling time. And that's something you have control over today, as opposed to something that's a little bit harder to control, which is the number of selling hours.
Yeah, I I like that perspective for sure.
And
That
then
makes
when you
sense.
get more selling hours, they come at a higher productivity rate. I mean, I had this long conversation with the person that wanted to be on my show a couple of years ago, actually, and we were having this discussion because he wanted to talk about that he was actually passionate about the way to make sellers more quote unquote productive is find a way to give them more hours, and he thought he had this idea for that. And I just didn't agree. And I was like, I just start from the premise that I'm never going to get more time. And so rather than worry about not getting more time, I want to get more out of the time that I know I have.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. I completely agree, right? It's not always just about how much time. It's also how productive you are with the time you have, right? So I think I draw a similar parallel even to the role of a manager, right? We could talk about removing, freeing up more hours and that sort of thing. But I agree. Part of that might come down to, okay, I know I have X number of hours per week for coaching.
Right.
How could I make that time as effective as possible? How
Absolutely.
do I have the right skills to make that time as valuable as possible? Right. So, completely agree with the sentiment. I think that's a great observation. And I want to see sales leaders spend the same amount of time in considering that for the sales managers, right, and the leaders, if you will.
I agree.
I think that could definitely drive better performance.
Absolutely agree. So here's an idea, and this is a bit apocryphal, but nonetheless, as an example, just to illustrate, is right now I think we spend roughly, stats are $20 billion a year in the United States on sales training. And my estimate, and you tell me if you think I'm wrong or right, but maybe 5% of that amount, maybe $1 billion of that is spent on training sales managers. Maybe 10% we'll give on a stretch, right?
Yeah.
So back to this idea about what really influences performance improvement. And there's been multiple studies showing that effective coaching is the single most important lever you can pull to improve individual sales performance, maybe up to, I think, a couple studies showing like 17 to 19% uplift in performance. So what if we flipped that spend on its head? What if we spent, of the $20 billion, what if we spent $90 billion training managers how to be better coaches and spent $10 billion on training sellers? And if coaching is really that decisive, what do you think would happen with sales performance?
I definitely think you'd see a lift for sure. Like if no question. If you flip that and you really enable the managers to be highly effective coaches and leaders and other skills that are needed to be to be super effective in that role, there's no question that there would be a lift there. I think the only caveat to that is I think we need to make sure that we are still providing the right level of training for the sellers as well, right? There's definitely a need to get those institutional skills implemented. But yes, if we had, even if I like your question there, even if it was an uptick of double, right, what we're doing today, if it truly was 10% and we can get that to 20%, that I think would have tremendous value.
Yeah,
far more than, I think it would be far more than the incremental equivalent, right, of what
spent
we're spending
on sellers, individual sellers. Absolutely. Yes. Well, I think we have to sort of relook, among many things. There's lots of conversations of how we fundamentally change the way we're structuring sales, the way we structure our employee-employer relationships, compensation, all this. And it seems like personal development is part of that, right? Let's stop calling it training. Let's talk about individual development, whatever we want to call it. It seems like there has to be a better way. And for me, one idea that I keep coming back to and thinking about and talking to people about is, instead of having this corporate delivered training, there has been this explosion because of COVID, but even in advance of COVID, of people offering incredible online training resources, development resources, such as yourself and a whole panoply of companies out there. Is what if we tied development to compensation? And one of the ways we also encourage that then is, instead of having a corporate training budget that's spent by sales enablement, is we give people stipends. You have an individual budget that you need to spend on training this year, and here are the list of programs we've vetted as enablement that you can go to. It could be Janek, it could be whomever else, right? But you need to take it. They've got courses. You need to perform at a certain level. but you can pretty much choose based on you and your coach and your manager sitting down thinking these are the areas you need to improve on the most and so on. It seems like that's a better approach we should be sort of aiming at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I think if you look at the root of that consideration, I think a lot of development has to come back to the individual taking ownership for their development.
Exactly.
So if you empower them with a budget, and it's a required budget to spend in order to achieve certain commission thresholds or compensation or whatever, that budget's going to be spent. But if I can get my seller to take some ownership, yes, as a manager, I need to help them identify development opportunities. But if I can get them to be thinking about that consistently, right, and then yes, giving them a budget to do that appropriately, then I think yes, that's a winning formula. We had a client that did that. Recently, they shifted completely from a corporate ran sales training program and shifted it pretty much completely. I think it was like 80% of their budget shifted into the hands of the sellers and sales leaders directly. It was a large clothing manufacturer, consumer goods company.
Right.
And they've seen an uptick, right, in performance. I think partly because, they're now getting training done faster. I think there's an efficiency consideration of that as well versus like the slow moving, let's get this huge event set up sort of thing that, can just be very challenging. People can just find the resources themselves, right? So I think that's been helpful from an efficiency standpoint, but I think it goes back to that original point. You're empowering the people, right, on their own individual development, and that's been successful for them.
Yeah, I think that empowering, as you talked about, the individual is, I think the knock-on effects from that is that as they take ownership of it, they then begin to take ownership perhaps in dimensions beyond just the sales training, right? Is reading a sales book on their own time, right? Is being curious about their development as an individual and the things that could affect their performance, whether it's getting enough sleep, whether it's getting enough exercise, these other things that I think there'd be these connections that are made in the minds of the individuals saying, yeah, I'm investing in my own development. What are other ways I can do that? Because I'm starting to see some results.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, great perspective. I think that chain reaction is hopefully evident, right? Like you are investing time into this development. So I see that as a great opportunity to do that in other areas of my life as well, right? So, hopefully, people have that outcome for sure. I know just in my own personal experience, I've seen that as well, right? You start to want to improve in other areas, right? And taking that ownership, enables you to do that.
Well, I think that, and sort of touching back on a theme I just talked about is I think this is going to be a coming trend, is this sort of holistic look at performance, right? I mean, again, I'm a huge soccer fan and read quite a lot about how they coach and train players and at the top levels of the game, like in the English Premier League and so on. And they measure and track everything: sleep, diet, how they trained, right? The quality of the training they did. And it's all looked at and all monitored and all managed. And yet we think that from a sales perspective, and this is a performance sport, right? In the business world, this is the performance athletes. And we don't pay any attention to sleep, diet, exercise, fitness, the things that every day when someone wakes up have an impact on their ability to perform that day. Could not agree more. That's sports is a science. Performance is a science.
Performance is a science. We're seeing a little, some trends in that with technology enables us to do those sort of things, right? Sleep tracking and intake and that sort of thing.
I've got my Whoop band on.
So, there you go. Yeah, I got my Fitbit here as well, right? So you're tracking that stuff more closely, right? But yes, I agree. It's something that we should be looking at.
Yeah, I just wonder how we institutionalize that, right? It's how do we get management to take that part seriously? Where we're saying, look, we really do want to improve performance, and we now begin to understand it's not just what happens between 8 and 5 that dictates our seller's ability to perform. It's what happens 7-24.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough challenge. I mean, I think you got to the difficult. It's those difficult conversations that you need to have with leaders within these organizations, and they the idea of thinking bigger, if you will, right, and not just focused on performance at the workplace. Maybe the changes from COVID might impact that. Because a lot of us are home. There isn't this as much of a separation between home and the office
Right.
as much, right? So maybe that'll start to enable sales leaders to think about it through that lens, right? Like we're now in an environment we're almost working all the time, right? Because we're home and you're choosing to work, and during certain hours or whatever. So yeah, maybe that change might spur some of those conversations more.
Yeah, I just find it, again, because we draw these comparisons between sales and athletes. And athletes have a pretty short career, and elite athletes, professional athletes, and yet they also don't draw those hard lines between this is work and this is non-work life, because they know that what they eat. I mean, their diets are so strictly controlled, calorie intake. But fitness, sleep, all these other things, they accept the fact that, they need to track those things because it has an impact on their ability to perform their job. And that seems to be here, at least, maybe just in the US, but for most sellers, they would view that as being hugely intrusive and upsetting of the work-life balance, as opposed to, it's not really about balancing work. It's about how do we make you just better at this thing that's producing your income.
Yeah. I mean, look at the top athletes. I know we're drawing the sports analogy, but it's very relevant. I mean, look at LeBron James. Look at Tom Brady, right? Look at how can you perform at the level that they are performing at the age they're performing if you're not considering all of those things from a performance standpoint. If they just focused on getting better at the sport, right? They're already really great at the sport. Not that they can't get better. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But if that was the only thing they focused on, and they didn't focus on all of those other things, sleep, food, exercise, water intake, I mean, whatever the things that they're focusing on, some of these athletes are spending $1 million a year on their bodies.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Or more. So if they weren't doing that, to your point, you'd never be able to have the elite level of performance for the time that they have if they didn't do those things. So I agree. How can we get organizations to think about that through that same lens? And how could we get the salespeople, the frontline leaders, et cetera, to also realize the importance of that also, right? Because it certainly takes a concerted effort, right? Even if a sales leader did, to your point, you might still have those that are still feeling like that is intrusive, that's my time, if you will. And to some degree it is, but how do we get that mindset to change where it's not, well, that's my time versus I appreciate that I can continue to improve on my time so I can be better.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's and another thing you said in there that's really interesting too is you said it's what they have to do at their particular ages, because they're both older athletes. I mean, Brady's 42 now, 41, 42, and LeBron's 36, but has the miles on him of somebody who's traditionally 40 because he started playing at 18 in the professional level and still playing at this incredibly elite level. It's like they do different things to get better. They have different things they want to get better at, I guess is the more precise way of saying it, which is true for sellers too. And I think this is the other part of the perspective is what you need to get better at as a 40-year-old with nearly 20 years of experience in sales is dramatically different than what you need to get better at as a newbie coming into sales for the first time. And we tend not to differentiate that way either.
Yeah, completely agree.
All right. Well, Nick, unfortunately, we're running short on time here, but for people who want to learn more about what you guys do and connect with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so I think the best way to learn more about Janek as an organization is to visit our website. They can find it at janek.com. That's JANEK.com. If they wanted to connect with me directly, I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. Just look for me there, Nick Kane, Kane. We also do publish a lot of content and thought leadership on janek.com and with other sources as well, blogs, white papers, et cetera. So, feel free to take advantage of some of that content we're putting out as well. Yeah.
No, a good white paper I read recently there was how to engage the empowered B2B buyer. So recommend people download that and read that as well. So, well, Nick, thank you very much for taking the time.
You as well, Andy. Thanks again for having me.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of the show. And I want to thank my guest, Nick Kane, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you could also leave us a rating or review and let us know how we're doing, well, we'd certainly appreciate that. And you can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help. And thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.